Welcome, everybody, to this edition of a Canadian Patriot Podcast, where I am very, very happy to be joined by my good friend, Gerald Therrien in Toronto, a fellow real Canadian Patriot, and somebody who I got to say went very far early on in my development and my trying to learn how to think about reality more critically. We're talking here 18 or so years ago when I first met Gerry. And I was still organizing with the LaRouche organization back in those days, and we would go to Toronto, which was Gerry's home base with Madeline, his wife, and we'd stay there days on end. And Gerry would go through all of these amazing historical lessons, and that was the first time that I got a sense of what real historical analysis really was about, as far as storytelling, looking for the drama. And I hadn't gotten a lot of exposure to that, so I'm very grateful that I got that experience with Gerry that sort of like lit my fires and really gave me that taste for exploring history in a more interesting way than what we're conventionally given in school. And Gerry has collaborated. I published on the Canadian Patriot a lot of his writings. He's given classes to us as well. More recently, two of his books. He's been doing a whole series of books, Reconstructing Canadian History, Volume 1, being the approaching conflict 1753 to 1774, is available already on Amazon and on the Canadian Patriot site. Forlorn Hope, a lot thicker book still. That's volume 2 of his Unveiling of Canadian History, Quebec and Nova Scotia and the War for Independence 1775 to 1785. So those are both already available for purchase, including in the description box under this video. And more recently,
yes, please purchase.
Yes, Gerry's got to eat his soup. Soup's getting more expensive these days. But now we got, just recently, Gerry's published Volume 3, which is also available. I didn't get my hard copy yet. I'm still waiting in the mail for it to arrive. Gerry, you have a hard copy?
I got mine there.
Right there. Okay, Storming of Hell. What's the subtitle? The War for the territories northwest of the Ohio, 1786 to 1796. Cool.
Yes.
Yes,
I got my copy. And I just wanted to thank two very nice women who helped with the publishing of the book, Madison Holmes and Macy Holmes, who edited it and did the cover, which they did a wonderful job. So I just wanted to throw out a thank you to them at the start too.
Cool. Yeah, that was a real team effort. Yeah, they did a great job. So it's totally available right now. It's a really complex but very rewarding read to get through some of the machinations that I don't think have ever been addressed pertaining to British subversive efforts to stop the revolution from happening in the first place, and when they couldn't stop it, to sabotage it in a myriad of fascinatingly disgusting but interesting ways, and the incredible stories of the heroes who have been in so many instances forgotten, who were able to overcome these tricks and traps, is just incredible, both within America but globally as well. So I really appreciate what you did. And Gerry, I know we were talking a little bit before this podcast about the need to just get it in your own words. What is the story? What motivated you to get into this project? And what is this book, this volume 3? What is the gist of it? Why is it, what is so important and strategic about this lesson of history that you're bringing to the table?
Well, the reason I got into writing this history series is because Canadian history, the way it's written in most textbooks, is garbage. It should be thrown in the garbage. And I think when you and Cynthia were here in Toronto there this summer, you actually brought up a very good point in your talk, and you said how you can't really look at Canadian history in isolation. You also have to look at American history and British history and French history as part of it. Otherwise, there is no such thing as Canadian history. And it reminded me of something Lyndon LaRouche said one time. He says, I'm paraphrasing him, he says, there's no such thing as American history. Also, there's no such thing as Canadian history. what there is human history. And we're just looking at the history of humanity as it's tried to understand how to govern itself. So we could look at human history from a Canadian perspective or an American perspective or British perspective to get a sense of so-called Canadian history, because otherwise there is none. And you really have to look at Canadian history both from the British standpoint, who we were under for a long time and still are, and also the influence of the United States and France, and try to see Canadian history in that milieu, that whole thing going around. And some of this, well, actually, the name of the book, The Storming of Hell, I wanted to talk about that for a second, because there's a little quote I have right at the front of the book, and I'll just read it. During the American Revolution, when General Washington had asked General Wayne to undertake an extremely perilous enterprise, it was the storming of Stony Point, General Wayne looked at Washington and replied, "General, I will storm hell if you will only plan it." So it's rather a humorous quote, but so that's what I named it after. And you can see on the cover of the book, you actually see General Wayne. And when I was doing a lot of research in that, I found out the British ran this slander campaign against Wayne because they hated him so much. And they started this crazy story that one of his soldiers didn't like him and said, "Oh, that man is mad." And so the British started calling him Mad Anthony Wayne. And if you pick up all these history books, a bunch of the authors will actually call him Mad Anthony Wayne.
Amazing. I looked into it, and they all of these academics are like they're in a schoolyard having passed on the funny nickname that a bully gave some poor kid, and they're all like doing it, and you're like, it's so childishly weird. They do the same thing for Wacky Bennett too, right? Like W.A.C. Bennett. All of these respectable scholars call him Wacky Bennett. But this guy, when you look at him, he was actually fighting the oligarchy, and his enemies gave him like a stupid little slander name, and then it became all of a sudden his new name. But all that to say, as a side note, back to Anthony Wayne,
It's just he was such an American hero that they tried to discredit him with that. But there was also a good point to it, because whenever I opened up a book and they call him Anthony Wayne, I'd throw it in the garbage because this book is crap, because it's just going to give us the British Empire version of it. So I would find historians, American historians mainly, that just called him General Anthony Wayne. I said, "Oh, this must be a good one because they don't call him Mad." So it was a good sifting out point. But the book, it really comes down to Wayne in the end. It kind of, well, let me go through it. I divided the book into 3 parts: the Western frontier, the Canadian frontier, because this is right at the time when Canada, by Canada, I mean Quebec at that time, got its first legislative assembly in 1791. And then part 3, peace on the frontier. So the Canadian frontier is kind of mushed in between. And it starts out, most people think after the American Revolution, oh, the British and the Americans signed a peace treaty and everything was just, oh, lovey-dovey. We agreed on everything. When the actual case is, they signed the so-called peace agreement, but the British refused to give up the Western frontier posts. Actually, can I do a screen share?
Yes, you can. You have co-hosting, so you
Okay.
can just hit share screen.
Okay, can you see that?
I can indeed, yes.
Okay, so the war is over. They've established the boundaries between British North America, that is Canada, and the United States, and it goes, down the St. Lawrence River, through the middle of Lake Ontario, the middle of Lake Erie, the middle of Lake Huron, and the middle of Lake Superior. Fine. But Here you have a British post, Oswegatchie, which is on the American side of the St. Lawrence River. You have a British post, Oswego, on the American side of Lake Ontario. They have another one, Fort Niagara, which is right at the end of the Niagara River, which is on the American side of the river. You have Presqu'Île, today Erie, Pennsylvania, on the American side of Lake Erie. The same with Sandusky. Detroit is on the American side of the Detroit River. Michilimackinac is on the American.
Hmm.
So you have all these posts on the American side of the boundary, on American territory that they agreed on after the peace ending the Revolutionary War, and Britain refuses to hand over these posts to the United States. And why is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why is that?
Yeah, here how do I end screen sharing? Right
Oh,
there.
yeah.
Okay, good. So you get an idea from that slide. Well, one, the British wanted to maintain control of all traffic on the Great Lakes. If they had the posts there, they could make sure no American vessels came out onto the Great Lakes for trade or for whatever. So they wanted to control it. Also, they wanted to control the Western Indians, the Native Americans, indigenous peoples. Back in those days, they called them Indians. So in the book, I continued with that name as
I don't think anyone's going to take offense. I mean, you're using the terminology
okay,
that
good.
everybody is using at the time in the letters and everything. So what are you going to do, right? So anybody
Yep.
who's a little bit too sensitive needs to get some tougher skin and just take it in, take in the story.
Yes. So you had the British wanted to control the traffic on the Great Lakes. They wanted to control and manipulate the Indians so that they set up this thing called the British Indian Department to control the Indians through the control of trade with them, through the fur trade, as a way to attack the American settlements that were to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, what they called the Ohio country, because they wanted to stop the Americans from opening up the Ohio country. For one, the American government had planned on selling this land to settlers as a way to raise money to help pay off their Revolutionary War debts. And they had also promised land grants to veterans of the Continental Army. And now this is land that they had already acquired from the Indian nations in that area. An interesting thing is the Americans always signed a physical paper treaty with the Indians stating this and that and saying that the Indians were now under the protection of the Americans. The British never signed treaties. It was a verbal thing. Here, we'll give you some bows and ribbons, and you give us all this land. Okay, yeah, bye. We'll never see you again. And whereas the Americans, you can actually read these treaties and say, hey, maybe it wasn't such a great deal for the Indians, or maybe it was or wasn't. That's fair comment. But you have the treaties in writing, which everyone signed. The British would never sign a treaty.
Mm.
So the British launched this whole war against the Americans, even though they had just settled the American Revolution. Now they were launching another one to stop them spreading into the Ohio Valley, which is one of the reasons that the American Revolution was launched in the first place. And this is the whole period leading up to a key critical point in United States history, 1789, which was, well, the Americans passed this Constitution, and then they had election, and some guy named George Washington became president. The one guy the British were scared shitless of. So they had to kind of change plans at this point once Washington became president. So that's the first part of the book, leading up to this big confrontation.
Mm.
And then I go into
what year was that? The first presidential election of Washington? That was right after the Constitutional Convention, or
Yeah, 1788, 1789 is when he became president.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So 1788, 1789.
Because right now we're in the 1786 to onward phase, right? When the British are really holding their
Yes.
forts. They're holding the fort, literally.
Yeah.
Uh, and they just refuse to honor their side of the treaty to get to abandon the forts and give it over. They're refusing to budge. They're delaying, putting all
Yeah.
sorts of delaying tactics to stay in control,
Yeah.
like you said, for the
They
tooth.
make up all kinds of
Yeah.
crazy reasons why they won't hand it over. Like John Adams is the ambassador to London at the time, and he's meeting with them and fighting, and it's just like you say, delaying tactic, just to delay it, because they want to get this Indian war going against the Americans.
Mm,
So that's that 1785, 1786, right up until 1789, that period.
mm,
And they continue that after, but the it's all going to change with Washington becoming president, because the British had assumed the Continental Congress. There's nothing there. There's no leadership. They're never going to get together. We don't have to worry about them. We don't have to worry about America. And so they launched this whole program, not realizing the Americans were going to write a constitution and agree to it and have an election and have Washington become president. They weren't prepared for that. That was kind of out of the blue for them. They didn't think that would happen.
mm.
So, meanwhile, in Canada, you had the beginnings of a campaign to get a legislative assembly. Now, earlier, after the British got Canada, after the 7 Years' War, they gave a legislative assembly to Nova Scotia, no problem. And they gave one to Prince Edward Island, no problem. But they wouldn't give one to the French. Well, actually, the one they gave to Nova Scotia, first they took all the French Canadians and shipped them off down to Louisiana first.
Mm.
And then they gave Nova Scotia a legislative assembly. So,
Sorry, just quickly. Sorry, I'm so sorry. This is what happens with you,
yeah,
right? You say things, and then it makes me want to ask a question. And but I don't
good.
lose the main thread of your gestalt. However, the removal of the French Canadians. This is aside from the removal of the Acadians that happened earlier. This happened in another.
No, that is the
That is
Acadians.
Acadians being removed.
That's what
Okay,
I'm referring to. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, the removal of the Acadians, which were French Canadians in what today we would call New Brunswick.
Okay.
They were rounded up and shipped off to Louisiana. That's why there's this whole French population down there.
Okay.
And once they had ethnically cleansed Nova Scotia and New Brunswick of these pesky French Canadians, then they would give the English speaking population that was left a legislative assembly, no problem.
Okay.
So Quebec is saying, well, why not us? Why, the Quebec, and the British would say, well, the French Canadians aren't ready for this. They're not really ready for it. This democracy stuff is not for them. They're not for it. But then after the American Revolution, you had the Tories that came to Canada. Now, in Canada, we're not supposed to call them Tories, right? We're supposed to call them loyalists.
Huh.
But these were not farmers and merchants from America coming up to Canada. I mean, the farmers and merchants who supported the British during the Revolutionary War, they could stay in the United States. Yeah, they'd probably get a hard time, but they could stay. The people who had to leave were people who took up arms and fought against the Continental Army, who fought against the Americans in the Revolutionary War. These are people who joined various militia groups, which became part of the British Army.
Mm.
So the so-called Tories, the so-called loyalists who came to Canada, were not farmers and merchants. These were militia members. These were soldiers who came up here, who fought against the Americans. So there was no way the Americans were going to let them stay in the United States. So that's who we got. And most of them, they came to Nova Scotia, and most of them didn't like that. A few came to Quebec, they didn't like that. So the British gave them all this free land. They had hoodwinked the Indians into giving to them in what we call today Ontario.
Right.
Between Kingston and Ottawa, that whole stretch. We have to call it loyalists, but these were Tory militia soldiers who settled there. And now, the interesting thing, and this feeds into some of the work you were doing, Matt. So at that time, Guy Carleton, who had been the commander-in-chief of all the British forces in the United States, who oversaw the Tories coming to Canada, he is appointed the Governor General of Canada. So he's going to oversee all this stuff now. The interesting thing is when he comes over, his brother, Christopher Carleton, comes with him. And Christopher Carleton is made the Grand Commander of all of the Freemasons in Quebec, in Canada. Now, all the work that you and Cynthia have been doing on the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians and Albert Pike and the Scottish Rite in the United States, and also with Aaron Burr, who took over the Freemasonic networks that Prevost had set up in the United States, are now in direct alliance with Canada through the Governor General, whose brother is the Grand Master of the Freemasons. So it's kind of a controlled operation in Canada. And the problem is these Tories who came to Canada, now they want a legislative assembly. So now the French Canadians want one, but if we deny them one, do we deny it to the Tories? Or if we give one to the Tories, do we have to give one to the French too? So it's a big conundrum they're facing, and they're kind of stalling until, two things happened in 1789. One is the French Revolution and their Declaration of the Rights of Man. I mean, this is the early phases of the French Revolution, which you've written about a lot, Matt, how initially it was very Republican spirited, very good people who were leading it until Robespierre came in and they lost their heads. But so in 1789, you had this positive development in France, and they were worried these ideas might spread in Quebec. And at the same time, you just have Washington elected president of the United States. So the British have to deal with this Quebec situation now. And they decided, yes, we're going to give them an assembly, even though the law in England is if you're Catholic, you're not allowed to. But they made an exception, And the funny thing is, when you look at the so-called Canada Act, British North America Act of 1791, it's just an old version. During the Revolutionary War, the early stages, 1776, I think, the British sent this whole delegation over to the United States to meet with a delegation of the Americans. Ben Franklin was part of that delegation, went out in the ship and met with this guy named Carlisle, who was the head of the British delegation. And they were saying, okay, we'll give you the right to have, your own government, and you can pass your own laws, except for one teeny tiny little itty bitty request that any laws you pass can be vetoed by the Privy Council in London. So the Americans, of course, refused this thing, saying, no way, that we want to be independent. If we give you the veto, then what are we fighting for? So anyway, to make a long story short, the Canadians got what I call the Carlisle option. Yes, you can have
that's the root of the 1791 creation of the Legislative Assembly in Canada, was what the Americans rejected earlier, which always could get vetoed by the ruling hand of the crown. That's interesting.
Yes. Yes, we got we got what the Americans refused. They didn't want. So they gave, interesting enough, this is also what they gave to Ireland. Oh, yes, you can have your own parliament, you can pass your own laws, except we get the veto over it if we don't like it. So this is what Canada got stuck with, which is, I mean, it's funny, but it is still there today. People don't realize it, that our parliament can pass a law. This weird thing we call the Senate can also pass it. And the Privy Council of Canada can veto that bill if they don't like it. Now, there hasn't been too many lately because, well, the Privy Council runs the government of Justin Trudeau, but there are points in history, you can go back and find them, where our own parliament has passed laws that have been vetoed by the Privy Council and sent back to be changed.
Do you have
So
any?
it still exists.
Do you have any examples of any of those?
Not off the top of my head, no, but there are certain examples
Okay.
that are like that because on paper, the head of Canada is the Queen, well, now the King,
Yeah.
right? King Chuck the Third, and his representatives in Canada, the Governor General and the Privy Council.
Yeah.
So they actually are on paper legally, and it's hidden quite well, but it goes back to 1791.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I mean, even now, you still need royal assent after something passes through the House of Commons and the Senate and becomes so-called law. It doesn't become law; it has to get royal assent, as in like the granting
Yes.
permission by the royal to allow it to then be made into law. And that has an absurd framework that it assumes about the nature of the origins of political or legal authority in the first place. And the other thing is, I think that by putting this in there philosophically, well, and it has a philosophical and pragmatic advantage for the empire. On the philosophical level, it keeps us in this psychological state where we somehow don't recognize that that rights are inalienable in all of us. They're not granted to, and laws are not granted to us by another alpha human. So psychologically, it makes us castrated from judging what a good or a bad law is. And on a practical level, if there should ever be a disruptive influence inside of the Canadian system or a movement that is able to like organize to disrupt the imperial machinations systemically, that could be crushed if need be. And up until now, more often than not, the system is so relatively self-controlling that it hasn't needed to on too many times it hasn't needed to utilize that power, but the power to do it is still there, as we've seen in the case of Australia, where the governor general was able to flush a belligerent, disruptive prime minister with the case of Gough Whitlam in the 70s. They did it. And the same type of premise is right there with the mechanism in place in Canada, should that ever be needed. So that's two aspects, practical and philosophical, that are both embedded in there. So yeah, very good that you went through the origins of that in 1791. That's very, very useful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also throw in a little addendum in that part about slavery in Canada because, they had these hearings on, when Guy Carleton, the Governor General, came to Canada, he had hearings. I think this was 1788 on, he wanted to hear why people wanted to have a legislative assembly. And the merchants of Montreal actually put forward a proposal to eliminate slavery in Canada just by banning the importation of any more slaves coming in, and it would slowly fade away. And I show in the book at the time, there wasn't a lot of slavery in Quebec. In fact, Thomas Jefferson owned more slaves than all of Canada.
Wow.
So it wasn't a lot.
Huh.
The slaves that came with the Tories. The Tories got to leave the United States with whatever they could bring with them, and they got to bring all their slaves, no problem. So most of that slavery came to Ontario. And so later, In fact, 1791, when Ontario got its first legislative assemblies, one of the first things they did was to pass a law to ban the importation of slaves so that they would end it right away. But it really goes back to this group in Montreal that were pushing for it years earlier. I mean, it's kind of funny because you're in Ontario and you pass a law to ban the importation of slaves. And really, you're saying only the Tories are allowed to have slaves, no one else can.
Right.
So it was totally weird, but it because I was reading a book, interesting enough, a slave ship never came to Canada,
Hmm.
to Quebec. Never. There was never an actual slave ship that landed here. And so slaves were very, very expensive. And the only way you could get them were, well, you had the sugar mills in Montreal. So they would take their ships and go down to the slave islands in the Caribbean, like Haiti, Jamaica, pick up their sugar to bring back to Quebec to make it in sugarcane they picked up rather to bring it back to Montreal to make it into sugar. So sometimes on their trip back, they purchased a couple slaves in Jamaica and brought them back with them. And that's how African slaves made it into Canada. There were no slave ships, it was the sugar ships
What
that brought it into Montreal,
what
like
about the
McGill.
Oh, with McGill? Oh, what about
Yes.
the case?
Yeah.
I'd read somewhere, and I think you were telling me years ago, and I forgot the details, that some of the slaves during the American Revolution were promised land in British territories, which if they fought with the British against the revolutionaries, and of course you had slaves for people who had been slaves who fought with the revolutionaries who got their freedom, and then those who fought against it with the Brit on the British side who did get some territory or land or something like that in the Maritimes. But can you refresh my memory? What was wasn't there that element also
Yeah.
of black people being brought up?
During during the Revolutionary War, the British Army promised any slave who fled from their plantation and made it to the British lines, promised them freedom. But really, they promised them a job in the British Army fighting against the Americans and said they were going to give them freedom after the war. But the British did that not all out of their love to free the slaves, but out of a way to disrupt the economy in the southern states, which were slave dependent.
Hmm.
And after the war, these so-called, they called them free blacks, who had joined the British Army under the promise of getting their freedom, they were also, a lot of them were shipped to Nova Scotia, which is interesting because they're on the boats where the Tories are going to Nova Scotia with their slaves. And beside them is the free blacks who are also going to Nova Scotia. But in Nova Scotia, the British tended to give free land and they'd give free tools and equipment and free supplies to the Tories to help them for the first couple of years. And they were supposed to help out the free blacks in that same way, but they never did. And the blacks were, even though they were free, were treated as if they were slaves too. There's a horrible story of the way blacks were treated in Nova Scotia.
I had heard that
And
they got the least fertile soil that was useless for farming. They were told you could farm up there and you couldn't. So there was starvation. There was a lot of
yeah,
depredation.
so most of those free blacks ended up going to Africa, to Sierra Leone.
Oh,
They went back. There was a movement run out of England. Well, it was kind of two movements. One was run by a man named Granville Sharp, who was a good friend of Benjamin Franklin's, who was trying to help uh, end slavery in Britain, in London, because at the time, the law was kind of British people could own slaves in the colonies, but not in England itself. So, although there was some, but he tried to establish a colony in Sierra Leone for these free blacks, which eventually was taken over by, the British establishment, where they were just using it to play games. In other words, to kick the blacks out of their country, kind of the way they kicked the Jews out of Europe, send them to Palestine. They were trying to kick the blacks out of England and send them to Sierra Leone. But most of the free blacks that came to Canada ended up going to Sierra Leone because the conditions in Nova Scotia were so bad. They said anything, has got to be better than this.
Hmm.
So I go a bit into the history of that also in this section on Canada because it's important to understand the roots of it. And
Hmm.
it in a but also before that, most of the slaves in Canada were Indians. In that when Indian tribes would fight, the victorious tribe would claim, the tribe they just beat as slaves, the men slaves. So a lot of the French Canadian fur traders bought these slaves to and would bring them back to Quebec, but they found they didn't last long because you turned your back and they ran away. They knew how to live in the wilderness, and so they weren't kept. But the black slaves, uh, they were able to keep, but they were just so expensive in getting a black slave in Canada that was kind of used as a symbol of wealth, that the black slaves were like domestics in the house and serfs. So when you went to this guy's house, oh, he had a black person come and serve you, and that showed he had money. They didn't really use them out in the fields farming. They were, a domestic servant. So it was a strange slavery in Quebec, which was run through the sugar trade
Mm-hmm.
there. But it's
Okay, so
interesting.
yeah, absolutely. So getting back to the thrust of the story, you were saying that there was a sort of two-tiered system built in to the structure of Canada around this fake kind of government. And at the time, the British still hadn't abandoned their posts yet. They're still holding on to their posts, as you said, on the American
Mhm.
side of things. They're still trying to use that to sabotage the American economy. Early on, America was still what was America facing? Like what were the weaknesses that were giving the British the belief that they could undermine and undo the gains of the American Revolution economically or otherwise, or maybe through deploying natives as weapons. What were the weaknesses that America had at that time that made it so fragile and made the threat so high?
Well, the main problem was the huge war debts after the Revolutionary War. And that's what Alexander Hamilton tried to deal with, to assume all of the debts from the states into the federal government, to assume all the debts, consolidate them, and use that as a basis for starting the national bank. That was the deposits to start them. Because prior to that, America, it's like Canada. It was just an economy of raw materials, exporting raw materials, agricultural goods, predominantly to Britain, their number one trading partner, in exchange for manufactured goods. So the economy in the United States was really dependent upon Britain. So Washington was saying, well, we just fought this war. I got to buy some time so that we can get control of this debt, rebuild the economy, and do whatever we can to stop any further wars. And so the main idea of it was to open up the West, which would open up the United States to increased immigration, increased development of the West, farming, and rebuild the economy that way. Now, the British plan was that all of the land in the Ohio Valley, which was now part of the United States, they wanted to turn that into what they called an Indian buffer state, that this would be run by the Indians. And the Americans were going, well, that's what you did with the Quebec Act. You gave all this land to Quebec and the Indians. We fought the revolution. And now you want to go back to the same thing as if the revolution never took place, as if we didn't defeat you in the Revolutionary War.
Mm.
So that's why the British were keeping these posts to try to establish this Indian buffer state, because they controlled the Indians through the trade. That Cynthia goes through it a little bit in her book on the ghost dance, but the whole structure of the native society was destroyed by the fur trade. Prior to that, you had your chief, your hereditary chiefs, you had your medicine man, your form of religion, and it was structured. And with the slave trade, whoever was the craziest warrior who could go out and get the most slaves by hook or by crook and bring them back and trade with the British could get all these neat goods. You could get these guns, you could get metal pots, you could get alcohol. So they became more important than the actual chief and the medicine man.
Now you said
So,
you said who could go out and get as many slaves, but you meant furs, right?
oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Whoever could go out and get furs,
Yeah.
sorry, and slaves too, but
Mm.
predominantly fur trade, that you might kill someone to steal his
Right.
furs or just go. Well, they started it became a war among the Indian tribes. As you depleted the fur bearing animals in your area, you started going farther west
Right.
and engaged in wars against tribes who lived there so you could get their land to trap for furs.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And I've read about that, how different Indian bands would fight each other like gangs of New York style over
Yeah,
a scarcity of furs. And it was really like
yeah,
gangland ethos that was just infused into there because of this desire to turn furs into booze or whatever. And
yeah,
yeah, like a whole organized crime syndicate or culture, it seems to was groomed by the British through the fur trade. It was
yes,
fascinating what they did.
yeah,
Disgusting.
yeah. They call it the Beaver Wars,
Mm,
that whole period in time where
mm,
they were fighting. So they the Indians lost their ability to produce their own goods, and they were totally dependent on the British for knives and guns and, cutleries, that type of stuff. And this is how the British could control them
mm,
and would use them, conduct raids against the American colonies who were setting up towns in land that they had already agreed with the Indians by treaty that this was American land and that was Indian land. And the minute an American went into Indian land, he was subject to Indian laws, and you deal with him the way your law prescribes. But this was their plan to stop the expansion westward of the United States.
mm,
And so the third part of the book goes into what Washington does. And well, the first thing you do is Congress created the U.S. Army. They called it the Legion of the United States, a 5,000 man army, which would go out into the Ohio country and control the settlement, stop the Indian raids so they could actually conduct the survey of the land so they could sell it. That was the big problem. The surveyors would go out and get killed by Indian raids, and no one wanted to go and survey the land, so you couldn't sell it. So they created this uh, legion. And of course, who does Washington appoint to run it? Anthony Wayne,
mm.
his most trusted general. And he organized the whole force, which was a bunch of ragtags, and developed them into an actual disciplined army to sign any needed treaties with the Indians over any disputed territory. And also, the army was to protect the American settlements. And now, Washington's policy towards the Indians was different than, say from Jefferson on, it was a whole different policies. Washington's idea was that the Indians aren't going to survive unless they assimilate. So he says his policy was for assimilations, that if the Indians requested, say teachers to go there, or people instructing them on farming, modern farming methods, husbandry, how to raise animals. If they wanted a blacksmith in their town, Washington would provide them with that as part of the treaty agreements he had with them. If they requested it, it was up to them. You weren't going to force your way onto them. And a lot of the Indian tribes accepted that. And that was becoming part of the treaties between the United States government and the Indians, was this availability for assimilation. And beginning with Jefferson on, it stopped being that and just became a policy of grabbing more and more land from the Indians, and
just quick, because
until you have Jackson.
the word assimilation has, I think, gotten such it's so negative. What do you mean by it? Because you obviously you're not looking at the purely Borg-like homogenization, you will be assimilated type of thing that we've all been encountering, but you've got a different, more positive idea of it than most people do listening. So what would be the negative? What would be the positive idea of it? What would be the more, yeah,
Well,
what's
the
it, what's the
positive,
way of looking at it that would
it's
like get rid of
it's the same.
your language?
Yeah, it's the same concept of the American Revolution, the consent of the government. This is Indian land. You set up your own laws to govern yourselves, but you're not going to survive in, going back to, the days of just running around hunting and gathering. That you deserve the right to modern technology. If you wish, we will help you acquire the same technology we have so that you can develop modern farming, develop, raising of animals, this type of stuff, so that your town can be a functioning town and you can actually support a growing population. Because the way it is now, you can't. And once you deplete the resources you're at, you're going to go fight your neighbor for his resources. So it was a policy to have the American Indian become part of the United States.
Yeah.
That was Washington's outlook. That also, with these agreements, it said that you now are protected by the United States from any attack of any foreign entity, so that you're part of the United States and we will protect you, and it's up to you how you want to proceed. But it was a very positive outlook on Washington's part that I don't think enough people give him credit for. I mean, you have the later policies, just genocide under Andrew Jackson, with the Trail of Tears and just forced deportation. This is just ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
But you can't equate that with the entire policy of the United States. That's not what it was under Washington.
Mm.
And it's not what it was under Adams.
Mm.
But with Jefferson, it changed a little because he had some weird idea where he was going to, after the Louisiana Purchase, everybody living west of the Mississippi, all the French and Spanish settlers, okay, you're all going to move to the east side of the Mississippi, and all the natives on the east side of the Mississippi, you're going to move to the west side, and you'll have whatever they left behind. And it was rather absurd, but it's
weird.
Well, it becomes the idea that land is important, where with Washington, land is not important, knowledge is important.
Mm.
If an Indian tribe is given the knowledge of agriculture and blacksmith and husbandry, that's power, not land. You don't need
Yeah.
a lot of land.
No, I think this little aside is very important, especially in this day and age, which it's difficult, and I know it was very difficult for my mind originally to wrap itself around this idea that allowing for universal values, or the idea that there is something universal in all human beings that transcends the particulars of culture and language differences and ethnicity, it creates some some dangerous traps which an underdeveloped mind could fall into. Number one being that if that's true, then it just means that those who believe it should assume that differentiated cultural value systems and traditions must be destroyed as we adopt these universals. And it's not true. When you look at the highest quality thinkers in the Cherokee Nation and in different times, Benjamin Franklin's thinking, and many of the people that you're referring to, their idea was no, let's keep what makes us different culturally speaking, but at the same time adopt the universal right to access technology, which is not a white man's thing or a brown man's thing. Technology is the fruit of creative discoveries of our shared universe. And so we should all have the same universal right to access that knowledge of the universe and the fruits of it to make life better and more easier for ourselves and more secure. Um, and at the same time, cherish what makes our sacred stories and our language and things that also makes us unique and special. That should also coexist and not be it doesn't need to be squashed with what is universal. So I think that this little aside is very rare that people watching encounter it. So I'm very happy that you just said what you said to bring in that nuance, which otherwise, people I know myself 20 years ago would shut down mentally if I even heard the word assimilation. I'd be like, no, I'm done.
Yeah.
Privileged white male. I'm
Well, it's also there's an important part to assimilation is the idea of equality, that you're assuming the Indian tribe you're dealing with is equal to you and is capable of assimilating or adopting the parts of your technology it finds useful. They're an equal. Whereas if you assume it's just because of the land they're on, you're looking down on them like they're an animal. Well, Jefferson did own slaves, and I really had to separate out Washington because I think he's probably the most underrated American leader. What he went through leading the Continental Army and then becoming president is truly amazing, because without him there would not be a United States. It'd be all these factions fighting each other and quibbling. He made it a nation, and including when he set up this army under Wayne to deal with the British problem. And Wayne slowly moved towards where the British post was, where they were manipulating the Indians and supplying them with guns. And there was a great battle, which Wayne won, defeated the Indians. And then, the British are telling the Indians, yeah, you go fight them, and don't worry, we're right behind you. We're going to back you up, provide you all the weapons you want and everything. Once Wayne defeated the Indians in the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Indians fled back to the British fort. And the British shut the doors. They wouldn't let them in. They said, no, 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 no. Because the British, if they went out and joined in the Indians fighting, that was war. You were on American territory, you were fighting the US Army, that's war. And the British weren't ready to deal with that. So they basically locked the doors to the fort, wouldn't let the Indians in, wouldn't give them any more ammunition. And, the Indians are going, we really can't trust these Brits, can we? They lied there. It was an awakening. And shortly after that battle, the British realized the game is over, at least temporarily, and they quickly signed a treaty with the United States, the Jay Treaty, which got a lot of criticism in the United States, and even Hamilton and Washington didn't like it, but they said, look, this is the best thing. we're going to get from the British.
Mm.
And in that treaty, the British turned over the forts, and that's what they wanted. And that's why Washington signed the Jay Treaty, even though it wasn't good. It was basically delaying an inevitable fight with the British over certain other things. But so Wayne got to march up to Detroit and take control of Fort Detroit on American territory. And that was the end of the British control of the Indians in the Ohio Valley. And the interesting thing was, I love Wayne for this. So, who's he going to get to become the commander of Fort Detroit? So, he picks this guy, Jean Francois Hamtramck. Now, in volume 2 of my book, I talk about the Canadians who actually volunteered and joined the Continental Army. There were 2 Canadian regiments in the Continental Army from Quebec. Jean-Francois Hamtramck was one of these. After the American Revolution, he stayed in the United States. He stayed in the Army. So he became a colonel, and Wayne makes him commandant of Fort Detroit because everybody living there is French. So here you've got a French Canadian who's risen up through the United States Army, the ranks, and is now commandant and in charge of this area. So it was very ironic, and in fact, I think there's a town named after him in the Detroit area, Hamtramck. It's an interesting story on him. And then, can I just read a bit more of the book?
Yeah. Please do.
Okay, the very end of the book, because in 1799, which is a little past the end of the book, but Washington dies. And it really was devastating for the American population. That was their hero. And so Congress, declared a day of mourning. They had a big funeral. Everything was shut down. Every town in the United States would have their own ceremony to honor Washington. And public testimonials of grief and reverence were displayed in every part of the Union, as many as 300 ceremonies, 300 different towns.
Mm.
But Vice President Thomas Jefferson, he was vice president at the time under John Adams, would not attend a single memorial service. What a son of a bitch. I mean, you have an ego that's that huge. You have a grudge against Washington that's large. He refused to attend any memorial services for Washington. He may have been the only person in the whole country who didn't go to one.
I'm sure Aaron Burr probably didn't want to. Maybe he went for for appearance's sake. But why was that? Why was there such a hostility that Jefferson felt towards Washington that do this?
Well, Washington had an ego. No, not Washington. Excuse me. Jefferson had an ego that was so large. It's amazing he actually got his head through a doorway. He thought he was the greatest gift to man. Now, it's interesting. If you look at Jefferson, what did he write?
What did he write?
Nothing. He wrote nothing.
Okay. Didn't he write the Declaration of Independence? That's what everyone learns in school.
No, well, his handwriting, he never wrote it. He was told what to write by Franklin and a few other delegates. But yeah, you have this myth of Jefferson, the genius.
He's a
he was part of
Enlightenment philosopher genius. He discovered things, right? Didn't he invent things?
Did he?
I don't know.
What did he invent?
Rocking
what did he write? Did he write any pamphlets? Did he write any articles?
A new design
Nothing.
chair. Didn't he?
Yeah. Oh my God. I don't know. So there's this whole myth of Jefferson, who was one of the greatest schemers known to man, and he did it through correspondence. He wrote to people all over, but it wasn't necessarily the same thing to each person. But he never actually wrote anything. There was no fundamental ideas he promulgated.
Okay.
So he was very upset because when Washington was president, he wanted everyone's opinion. Before he made a decision, he asked everyone in his cabinet for their opinion. And if there was differences, he'd have them argue it out. And then he would sit back and look at everything and make his decision.
It's kind of like very
And
similar to the method of the natives as well, right? When you hear the stories of how they'd come to their deliberations over days and days of like discussion, deliberation before they came to a conclusion, and it frustrated a lot of the white Europeans because they're like, "Can't we just come to a decision? Why do we have to wait another week?" And they're like, "No, let's
yes,
really think about
we
it."
have to talk this out.
Yeah, Ben Franklin,
Because
Washington.
Washington wasn't a dictator.
Yeah,
He was a president.
but what?
So,
And Jefferson
and
like
most
that? I thought
times,
Jefferson was like the Democratic man. Didn't he like this idea of deliberation or no?
only if he gets his way. And most times, Washington went with Hamilton because Hamilton was generally correct on this type of thing. And there was nasty things done where, like, Jefferson got a friend of his to come and start a newspaper in Washington, D.C., where he could attack the government because it wasn't doing life according to the great ideas of Thomas Jefferson. And he hired this guy as an interpreter in the State Department, and he never showed up for work one day, but that's how he got his money to run this newspaper. And one day they ran this cartoon of Washington, they were going to chop his head off in the guillotine because he wanted to make himself king. And Washington flipped out on this and saying, I led the American Revolution. I didn't accept 1 cent in pay. He never got paid for that, for being general of the Continental Army. Not 1 cent. He refused it. The minute the war was over, he resigned his command. Everything he spent as president was documented. He went by what Congress gave him. And he goes, they had the audacity to say, I'm a supporter of British monarchy. And, it was a Jefferson controlled paper. He kind of blew up. But there's other things that happened. But at a certain point, when Jefferson resigned from being Secretary of State after that, there was no correspondence between Jefferson and Washington. It was I had a good book on that. Maybe I'll lend it to you about this rift. There wasn't just a rift between Hamilton and Jefferson. There was a rift between Washington and Jefferson, which was far more basic on that. But yeah, Jefferson's ego overcame him. But it's interesting. He never attended any of these ceremonies. And then this is interesting. I want to read this. Of all the American presidents who were slaveholders, only President Washington freed all of his own slaves. Now, by Virginia law, he couldn't free the slaves of his wife. When he married his wife and she had slaves, they were still her property, and Washington was not allowed. By Virginia law, he could not free her slaves. So Martha Washington signed the deed of manumission for her deceased husband's slaves, and they all became free on January 1st, 1801. And it took me a while to realize what had actually just happened. George Washington, the American who in 1753 was tasked to lead the fight for the Ohio country when he was sent out there to fight the French, 1753, and who in 1775 was assigned to lead the Continental Army to victory over the British Empire, and who in 1789 was elected to lead the new republic as its first president, on his deathbed, as his last act as a mortal human being, did in effect join the emancipation movement to free the slaves, which was the next path forward for the American Revolution. And I just wanted to read that because I don't think people know that whole story about Washington, because it's no other president did that except him.
Yeah, I absolutely just to situate it the way you did is extremely important, and it has been washed out of the narrative of America's origin story, including from people who really like Washington, and haven't taken the full George
Mhm.
Soros woke, radical reinterpretation of American history is built on lies and slavery. But even for the people who like Washington, don't I've not seen any appreciation for this as the starting point of the emancipation of slavery movement, which is really him and Hamilton too, right? Hamilton being
And Ben Franklin really
yeah,
as well.
the guys
So
the
Washington
most slandered for
waited till the
being,
last day to die to join,
yeah, right. No, it's
but
funny.
he did join.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
very interesting that he got in just like an Indiana Jones moment, rolling in just as the thing's closing. But it's interesting that like Hamilton, if you think about how most patriots have been trained to think about their history in this period, the people who they think are the traitors are the ones like they think that Ben Franklin was a traitor and he's a Freemason, Hellfire Club, baby killer. That's something that's big, really pervasive amongst patriot communities who are trying to revive the proper American liberal Lockean traditions of Adam Smith. And it's such a joke because what Ben Franklin is the guy who made the revolution possible, who fought the most to break us from the empire and to liberate slaves, as well as uplift the natives at the same time in a common brotherhood of human beings fighting against empire. And Hamilton also did some of the heaviest lifting in that fight, and he's the one treated like a Rothschild stooge for bringing in the national bank. And George Washington, at best, is treated like a dupe, like a useful idiot of the Rothschild Hamiltonian banking evil cabal. And Jefferson and Aaron Burr are often treated like the great heroes, and Andrew Jackson, the great hero who fought the banks and paid the debt, are the heroes we should emulate and revive. And it's like, no, these are the worst. You're emulating the worst traitors and vipers of our history who, like you said, Jefferson never, he had more slaves than all of Canada, never freed them at all, just used them as like little sex things that he would procreate with. He'd be willing to do that, but he wouldn't be willing to give them freedom.
There was one slave that he did procreate with. There's a whole story to that
Okay, one slave.
because no, there's a story to it. When he was very much in love with his wife, and when his wife died, that really shook him. But now he had one slave, and the father of that slave was his wife's father. And it is said that that slave and his wife very much looked the same because they had the same father.
Interesting
Uh,
psychological variable. I didn't think about that.
yeah,
Interesting. Okay, psychological.
The Hemmings case, and that's
Huh.
the one where he actually fathered children with that slave, and it said because she looked just like his ex-wife. That's a whole other story,
That's more
and
complex. That's more psychologically
that's
complex than I was prepared for. Okay, interesting.
that's in that'll be in volume 4, that whole story. That'll be a little teaser for people to read volume 4 after I got volume 3 out, and I'm so happy. And I'm almost done. One of these days I got to get back to work on volume 5, but there's just so much interesting stuff that's going on in the world now that just gets your attention and you want to research it.
Yeah, no,
But
I think your work has been really invaluable, and any serious researcher, or just general patriot trying to make sense of their reality, whether you're in Canada or whether you're in America or whether you're in Europe or wherever, Timbuktu, uh, you really need to have your works on the bookshelf as references and really, really work through it. It's not easy light reading, but nothing that is valuable is ever easy and light. It takes work and active thinking. So I mean, you brought together a real tapestry. And when is volume 4? What's that gonna be about? Because you ended at 1796, I guess, with the final removal of the last British outposts, which finally happened. But then the story that's another successful battle in a much broader war. So what's the next phase of battle that you're going to be tackling?
well, I don't want to. talk about it too much, just little teasers. But in volume 4, we go into Ireland, the failed attempt at revolution in Ireland, the Haiti, or what's called Saint-Domingue, before it became Haiti, and their actual successful revolution in Haiti, and the support they got from the United States under President John Adams, which a lot of people do not know about, and was one of the key factors in allowing them to win in the end. Then he was betrayed when Jefferson became president, but that's a whole part on Haiti. And the third part is on the Louisiana Purchase, which Hamilton supported. He was all for the Louisiana Purchase. He just said he didn't think Jefferson had consciously done it. He said he was the luckiest man in the world, and he stumbled onto this thing just by pure chance. And Hamilton says, yes, buy it. And all the Federalists were against the Louisiana Purchase, but Hamilton was for it. Yes, we need it. Go for it. So there's some little hints for volume 4, and hopefully that'll come out next year. I think it's pretty well already. We'll have to get Madison and Macy ready again.
Yeah, we'll put them to work again, and for sure. Now I'm looking forward to that coming out. So, okay, so people need to do their homework to prepare for volume 4. So all of the links to volume 1 through 3 are going to be in the description box. Gerry, right there. That's what you have to look for.
And people who want to support my work, buy my book.
And subscribe to Gerry's Substack. I forgot to mention Gerry's got a fantastic Substack with daily musings, big and small. I mean, very, very fun thing to have pop in your inbox when you're drinking your coffee or tea in the morning, or just on break at work. But definitely subscribe, get the paid upgrade if you can. If not, Gerry puts out a lot of free stuff. And that's going to also be in the description box to subscribe to as well when this goes online. So, Gerry, my man, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to future lessons from you.
Okay, thanks very much, Matt. Bye.
All right, bye.